Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here, as always, is to take these huge, complex, global topics, just mountains of source material, and distill them. We want to give you the essential architecture, the shortcut to being, truly well-informed. And today we are taking on something pretty monumental. It's a cross-cultural, cross-century task. We're looking for the nexus, the connecting tissue, really, that links the global legal struggle for women's recognition.
And that's the key word, right? Recognition. This isn't just about acknowledgement. It's about full legal personhood.
Yeah.
About being seen as an independent agent.
Exactly. An agent. And this journey, it spans 13 centuries. It crosses radically different judicial systems. So let's unpack this deep dive. Our source material today is this fascinating synthesis of legal history, of jurisprudence. We are comparing three completely different, but as we'll see, deeply connected moments where the legal status of women was just redefined.
Radically redefined.
Totally. We're starting with the 7th century Islamic legal reforms in Arabia. Then we jump forward to the 20th century in the U.S., specifically the Supreme Court's holding in Roe v. Wade. And finally, we'll look at the evolution of modern Pakistani family law.
Three completely different worlds, legally speaking.
Right. And the mission, for you listening, is to synthesize these sources with us. We want to understand how these systems, separated by these huge gulfs of time and culture, could arrive at, well, really fundamental conclusions about female autonomy. And here's the central idea, the unifying thesis we're going to track across all of this. It's simple, but it's profound. Women are agents, not property.
And that distinction, agent versus property, that's everything. It's the difference between being an object in the eyes of the law and being a subject. And when you set the stage with that premise, it completely changes how you look at these historical moments.
It's not just a timeline of events, then.
No, not at all. What's so fascinating here is that we're not just comparing static legal codes on a shelf. We're analyzing legal revolutions, moments where the entire system was upended.
So three distinct moments.
Three distinct moments where the status of women was radically transformed, or at least affirmed, against these deeply entrenched social and legal norms of their time. Our goal is to find the legal principles, the DNA, that defines dignity and agency in these completely different frameworks.
Whether it's religious scripture, constitutional rights, or modern legislation.
Exactly. We're basically tracking the global evolution of personhood itself through the lens of women's rights.
Okay, that's a perfect frame. And to track that evolution, we have to start where this particular legal story begins, where the deepest reforms happened the earliest. Which takes us to Section 1. We're going back to the 7th century and the revolutionary foundation of Islamic jurisprudence.
A huge leap back in time, but where the groundwork is laid.
So, to really get the scale of this revolution, we have to understand the starting point, the baseline. Before Islam, the sources are clear. Women in Arabia existed in what's best described as a legal void.
A legal void is. It's a perfect term. It's not that there were bad laws, it's that there were often no laws protecting them. Society then, often called the Age of Ignorance, was just characterized by these extreme legal disadvantages, all held up by tribal custom.
So it wasn't codified law, it was just the way things are.
Precisely. And the way things are meant a woman had no legal standing outside of her relationship to a male guardian, a father, a husband, a brother. Her identity was entirely dependent.
Can you put that in a global context for us? How did it compare to, say, Rome or Persia at the time?
That's a great question because it highlights the severity. In contemporary Roman law or Sassanid Persian law, which were very complex, very patriarchal systems, women still often had some mechanism, however limited, some way to transfer property or have a say in guardianship.
Some loophole somewhere.
Right. In pre-Islamic Arabia, the lack of codified rights was just. It was absolute. It was brutal.
So let's get specific. Let's paint a picture of what this legal void actually looked like on the ground for a woman.
Okay, so first and foremost, total economic dependency. They had absolutely no right to inherit. When a father or husband died, the wealth, the property, the livestock, it all stayed exclusively within the male lineage.
Which means a woman could never, ever build her own wealth or security.
Never. And flowing from that, they had no right to own property independently. Even if she acquired something, maybe through her own work as a weaver or as a gift, it was legally considered under the control of her male guardian.
So she's not even a party to a contract.
She's part of the property in the contract.
Right.
Her legal identity was completely subsumed.
And of course that would extend to her personal life. The sources say forced marriages were standard practice.
They weren't just common, they were a function of the father's absolute authority.
Yeah.
And divorce Divorce was a one-way street. It was completely unilateral, a power held only by the husband. A woman had zero recourse to get out of a bad or even dangerous marriage.
And we have to mention the darkest part of this, which the source material really emphasizes to show how low the status of women was.
Yeah, we can't gloss over this. The horrific practice of wand, the burying of infant girls alive.
It's just horrifying to even think about.
It is, and it was driven by this toxic mix of patriarchal shame. The idea that a daughter was a potential disgrace, fear of poverty, the idea that a daughter was just another mouth to feed, a liability. This tells you her status was lower than valuable livestock, lower than property.
So that's the baseline: complete dependency, vulnerability, objectification. But then the sources pivot hard. They say that the Islamic foundation established by the Prophet Muhammad didn't just tweak this system, it overturned the entire thing.
Instantly. It wasn't a slow, incremental change. It was a comprehensive, revolutionary overhaul. He introduced legal, economic, personal, matrimonial rights that were, they were without parallel anywhere in the world at that time. They wouldn't show up in Western common law for many, many centuries.
I really want to spend some time on the scale of that shift. We're talking property rights, consent in marriage, personal autonomy, all being established in the 7th century. What was the core idea, the legal declaration that powered this whole thing?
The foundational shift, the absolute bedrock, is captured in a Quranic declaration. It's the ratio legis, the legal reason for everything that follows in family law. And it says quite simply, women have rights equal to their obligations.
Okay, just pause on that for a second. Rights equal to their obligations.
Think about the weight of that sentence in the context we just laid out. It immediately creates a framework of reciprocal personhood, of legal parity. Your rights are directly tied to your duties, which puts women and men on the same judicial footing as legal subjects.
It's not a favor, it's a balance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This isn't a nice societal suggestion. It's a theological mandate that becomes the absolute cornerstone of the judiciary.
That is just, it's a stunningly modern concept for the 7th century. The idea of equality of rights and obligations, that's the bedrock of modern rights discourse today.
It is. And it essentially provided the blueprint for the entire legal restructuring that followed. It was a command. Women must be treated with dignity, and their social and economic contributions must be legally secured. It moved the entire conversation from, what the tribe does to what the law mandates.
All right, so you have this powerful philosophical declaration, but legal revolutions, they're defined by action, right? By what happens in court. And this is where the source material gets, as you said, really interesting, because it gives us a specific foundational case, the case of Khansa bint Khidam.
Yes, this case is. It's arguably the most powerful example of how that new jurisprudence was applied immediately, in practice. It was the judicial shockwave that proved the declaration of agency wasn't just words.
So walk us through it. What happened, and why was what she did legally impossible just a few years earlier?
Okay, so Khansa bint Khidam's father marries her off without her consent. He's operating under the old patriarchal rules that gave him total authority over her. Now, in the old days, the age of ignorance, that would be the end of the story. She would have zero choices. She'd be transferred like an asset.
But she didn't accept it.
She did not. She did something that would have been absolutely unthinkable. She bypassed her family, she bypassed the tribal elders, the whole male-dominated structure, and she went straight to the top, to the highest legal authority, the Prophet Muhammad himself.
And she argued her own case.
She argued her own case. She stood before him and challenged her father's decision, stating explicitly that he had married her against her will.
And the response, what was the ruling?
And this is what cemented the whole thing in legal history. The Prophet didn't... he didn't send her back for mediation. He didn't tell her to work it out with her father. He instantly annulled the marriage. Instantly. The ruling was swift and definitive. The father's action was declared null and void. Why? Because the daughter's consent, her will, was the mandatory non-negotiable element, and it was missing.
That moment must have sent ripples.
Yeah.
No, shockwaves through the entire community. It wasn't just a simple divorce. It was a direct reversal of a father's power in the highest court.
It was a judicial dismantling of millennia of tradition in one single act. And from that one ruling, our sources derive 4 foundational legal principles that completely define the new era.
Okay, let's break them down. What's the first one?
First, and most obviously, marriage requires the woman's consent, period.
Right.
Without it, the contract isn't just undesirable, it is invalid. It formally established marriage as a bilateral agreement between two consenting adults.
Okay, that's huge. What's number 2?
Second, a woman has the legal standing to challenge her father's decision. This effectively says that absolute paternal authority ends where her personhood begins. His authority is not supreme.
Which flows right into the third one, which is about access.
Exactly. Third, women have immediate and direct access to the court. She didn't need a male intermediary, a guardian, or a lawyer to go and plead her case. She is a legal plaintiff in her own right.
And the fourth one feels like the the culmination of all of them.
It is, and it's maybe the most transformative of all. Fourth, women have a legal identity independent of male relatives. She's a legal subject whose consent, supersedes the arbitrary will of her guardian.
That is the very definition of legal agency. The law intervenes specifically to protect her independent will from external control. That precedent, a woman's voice being heard and acted upon immediately in the highest court, that's a benchmark for justice in any time period.
It is. It moved women from being legally invisible to being legally central. And it's the core judicial precedent for all the other economic and personal reforms that came next.
Right, because that one ruling laid the groundwork for this whole checklist of rights. The source material details 9 core legal transformations. Let's go through them because this shows the sweeping scope of this revolution.
And we should, because the goal here was clearly to secure a woman's independence from, the constant need for a man's financial support, to turn her from a liability into a fully fledged economic actor.
Okay, let's start with the economic front. The right to inherit and the right to own property. What did that actually mean for a 7th century woman?
The change was seismic. As we said before this, property only moved down the male line. With the new reforms, women were given fixed, non-negotiable shares of inheritance. From her father, her mother, her husband, her children. This was a revolutionary concept anywhere in the world.
So it wasn't just a suggestion, it was a fixed share.
A fixed share, mandated by law. Now, she often received a smaller share than a male relative, but that was tied to the fact that the male had the legal obligation for her financial maintenance. But the crucial part is, her share was hers. It was fixed, it was guaranteed, and it couldn't be taken away by family pressure.
So that establishes her as a permanent economic player. And the right to own property means she can then manage those assets.
Exactly. She could manage them, sell them, buy new assets, all in her own name. This is fundamental to agency, which brings us right to the third right, the right to contract and conduct business.
So there are examples of this happening.
Oh, absolutely. Early Islamic history is filled with examples of prominent women who were business owners, who entered into major contracts, who managed huge amounts of wealth. This is the definition of financial agency. It's not just the right to have property, but the right to use it and leverage it in the public square without needing a man's permission slip.
Okay, that's a powerful economic foundation. Now let's shift to matrimonial protections. The right to mahr, or the dower. This is often misunderstood today. How did it work as an instrument of legal and economic security?
Right. It's not just a symbolic gift. The mahr is a sum of money or property that's agreed on when the marriage contract is made.
Okay.
And it belongs solely, exclusively to the woman. Her husband has no claim on it, ever.
So it has a dual function.
It does. First, it's a required gesture, an acknowledgement of her dignity and worth upon entering the contract. But second, and this is the critical legal part, it's an immediate economic security blanket. If the marriage ends or if she finds herself in financial trouble, the mahr is guaranteed to her. It's a legally mandated insurance policy against being left with nothing.
So she's protected financially going into the marriage, and we've already covered the right to consent thanks to Khansa's case. But what about getting out of a marriage? The source talks about the right to seek divorce, khulʿ. How does this balance the husband's power of divorce, the talaq?
This is such a vital point for comparative law. Traditionally, the husband had the right to a unilateral divorce, the talaq. And the Islamic reforms, they kept that right for the husband, though it was heavily discouraged and regulated. But, and this is a huge but, they introduced a counter mechanism for the wife, the khulʿ.
Counterbalance.
A perfect counterbalance. Talaq is initiated by the husband. Khulʿ is initiated by the wife. It allows her to dissolve the marriage. The process typically involves her returning the mahr she received as a form of compensation.
So she has a way out.
She has an exit strategy. It's a recognition that she, too, has the right to end a marriage that is no longer working for her, spiritually or emotionally. It's the institutionalization of her agency in the dissolution of the contract.
So she's protected on entry with consent and more, and on exit with khulʿ. What about during the marriage itself?
That's the right to maintenance. This is the husband's legally required financial obligation to support his wife, food, shelter, clothing, regardless of her own personal wealth.
Mm?
She could be a millionaire from her own business and inheritance, and he's still legally obligated to provide for her.
It reinforces that balance of rights and obligations again.
It does. Her wealth is her own, but the primary financial burden for the household is on him. And finally, the last two rights are broader but just as important. The right to education, recognizing her intellectual and spiritual equality, and the overarching right to dignity, safety, and protection from harm. These weren't just abstract ideals. They were enforced by the courts.
It's just the speed and the comprehensiveness of it all is what's so remarkable. It wasn't a slow crawl. It was an instantaneous recognition of personhood, enforced from the top down. It really does create a historical benchmark we can measure other legal struggles against.
Absolutely. It shows that the core principle of agency of women as subjects, not objects, is achievable even in the most deeply patriarchal societies,
Right.
if the legal structure is given that revolutionary mandate to enforce it.
Okay, so now we have to execute that massive transition you mentioned earlier. We're about to jump 1,300 years.
Right. We're moving from 7th century religious law, with its focus on contracts, property, and marriage, straight into 20th century secular constitutional law in the United States. It's a huge leap.
The legal traditions, Sharia versus common law, are completely different. But the underlying question, it seems, remains the same. Are women recognized as full legal persons with independent decision-making authority?
Precisely. And here we're shifting the focus from property and divorce to something even more fundamental, in a way. Autonomy over one's own physical body, all defined within the framework of the U.S. Constitution.
And the case that brings this all into focus is, of course, Roe v. Wade in 1973. This case forced the Supreme Court to grapple with a question of personhood that is really an extension of the same agency debate we just saw in the 7th century.
It absolutely is. The fundamental question the court had to answer was this. Does a woman have a constitutionally protected autonomy over her own body, specifically when it comes to reproductive decisions? Or is the state free to control her decision-making in this incredibly intimate part of her life?
It puts the individual versus the state into sharp relief.
It does. It's a direct question of whether the woman is an individual whose private choices are protected from government intrusion, or if she's a vessel, a component whose life is subject to the control of the larger state. The decision, regardless of how it's been modified since, was a critical moment in defining the legal self.
So let's get into the details of the court-specific finding. It all hinged on this idea of privacy.
That's right. The core holding from the majority opinion was that a woman's right to privacy is broad enough to encompass a decision whether or not to terminate a pregnancy.
Now, that's pivotal because, as you mentioned, the right to privacy, it's not actually written out in the U.S. Constitution.
No, it's not there in black and white. The court had to derive it. They had to find it. And they rooted it in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Okay, wait, let's pause there. For those of us who aren't constitutional scholars, can you break that down? The 14th Amendment talks about due process, which sounds like a fair procedure. How do you get a right to privacy out of that?
That's a great question, and it's where the legal mechanics get really interesting. The Due Process Clause basically says the government can't deprive you of life, liberty, or property without a fair process. But over many decades, the Supreme Court developed this concept called substantive due process.
Substantive due process.
Right. It's the idea that some liberties, some rights, are so fundamental, so deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition, that the government can't infringe on them at all, even if they use fair procedures to do it.
So some things are just off limits for the government.
Exactly. And the court decided that the right to privacy, which covers things like marriage, contraception, raising your children, falls into this category of fundamental liberty. They talked about penumbras, or zones of privacy, that are implied by the Bill of Rights.
I see. So by saying that a woman's reproductive choices fall under this fundamental right to privacy, what was the court legally establishing about her status as a person?
It established three critical elements, and they all point directly back to her status as an independent legal agent.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, bodily autonomy was recognized as being under the protection of the Constitution. This means the individual, not the state, has the primary authority over their own physical body.
And second?
Second, privacy itself was affirmed as a fundamental constitutional right that included these intensely personal and intimate life choices. This put up a major barrier against government interference.
Okay, and the third one seems like the most direct link back to what we were just talking about.
It is. This is the direct philosophical link back to Khansa bint Khidam. The ruling recognized women as independent decision makers. The power to make this choice in consultation with her doctor belonged to her. It wasn't something to be dictated by a state legislature, at least not in the early stages of pregnancy.
That's the intersection point. That's incredible. Whether we were talking about a 7th century woman challenging her father's choice of a husband, or a 20th century woman asserting her right to make a medical decision, the legal principle is identical. It's the recognition of the woman as a full legal person whose independent will must be protected from outside control.
Exactly. Roe became this huge modern symbol of empowerment and autonomy in the West because it affirmed that a woman's life and choices couldn't be dictated by the state. It was a pivotal moment recognizing her as an agent, free from arbitrary state control in her private life, just like the 7th century reforms were pivotal in freeing women from arbitrary family control over her property and her marriage.
And beyond the dense legal text, what was the symbolic impact of this ruling in 1973? What did it mean culturally?
Oh, the symbolic impact was enormous. It really reinforced this idea that women were moving beyond a traditional role defined primarily by family and into a role defined by individual choice, career, and public life. For many people, it felt like the law was finally catching up to the reality that women were managing their own futures and that having control over your own reproductive life was, well, it was essential to achieving any kind of real equality.
It was an affirmation of independence in both private and public life.
Yes, and the sources really drive this intersection home. The Islamic and the American legal principles, for all their differences, they converge on this one major point. The law must secure the agency of the woman. It must reinforce the idea that women are agents, not property.
Okay, so we've laid out the revolutionary framework from the 7th century, and we've seen the constitutional affirmation of autonomy in the 20th century U.S. Now for the third piece of the puzzle. How does a modern state, one that's founded on the principles of Islamic law but is operating today, reconcile these ancient rights with the need for modern legal procedures?
And this is where our third case study, Pakistan, becomes so incredibly instructive. It's a perfect illustration of a country trying to take these conceptual fundamental rights that were granted centuries ago and institutionalize them, to make them real, enforceable, and procedurally fair in a really complex modern society.
And the focus here is Pakistan's big piece of legislation, the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance of 1961. The sources say this law was directly inspired by that original Islamic jurisprudence we discussed, but it was also trying to curb the abuses that had crept in through tradition and local customs.
That's exactly right. The problem over the centuries wasn't always the core legal principles. It was the total lack of procedural mechanisms to enforce them. So the 1961 ordinance stepped in to impose structure, to impose regulatory oversight, to make sure that justice wasn't just left to, an individual's conscience or unchecked patriarchal power.
Let's get into the specifics then. What were the practical regulatory changes this ordinance brought in? Because it seems like they directly target those unilateral power structures we talked about earlier.
They do. The ordinance was all about bringing bureaucratic rigor to areas that were just prone to informal individual abuse. The overall goal, you could say, was to secure the procedural dignity of the woman.
Procedural dignity. I like that. So what's the first key feature?
The first one was the regulation of polygamy. Now, while Islamic law does permit polygamy, it's under these incredibly strict conditions of justice and equality between wives. But tradition often allowed men to just take a second wife with no process at all.
So what did the ordinance do?
It put a massive check on that. It requires the husband to get permission from an arbitration council before contracting a second marriage. And this council has representatives from both his family and the first wife's family.
So how does that council act as a check?
It forces the husband to actually justify the need for a second marriage to an impartial body. He has to prove he could treat both wives equally, which is that fundamental but often ignored Islamic requirement. And here's the kicker. If he marries again without permission, he faces criminal penalties and he has to immediately pay back the entire mahr to the first wife.
Ah, so there are real consequences. It's a major deterrent.
A huge deterrent against just acting on a whim. It dramatically reins in that unilateral power.
Okay, what about divorce? How did the ordinance bring procedural fairness there?
It introduced clear divorce procedures. This was to replace the arbitrary, instantaneous verbal talaq that some husbands would use. I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and it was done.
So what's the new procedure?
The ordinance mandated three things. First, a formal written notice has to be sent to a local government body called a union council. Second, that counsel is required to try and mediate between the couple. And third, everything is meticulously recorded.
So it slows the whole process down.
It does. The husband can still issue the talaq, but it doesn't become legally effective for 90 days. And during that time, the counsel tries for reconciliation. This 90-day cooling-off period gives the woman time to organize her life, secure her maintenance, and ensures the decision isn't just a rash one made in anger. She becomes a recognized party to a legal process, not just the recipient of a verbal decree.
And these regulatory changes also extended to financial security after the marriage.
Right. Oh, yes. It dramatically strengthened maintenance rights. The financial support owed to the wife and children after a divorce is now clearly defined, and it's enforceable through the civil courts. This removes the ambiguity that so often left women and children completely destitute.
And for children.
It also established enhanced rights in child custody, with the primary focus being on the welfare of the child, and it prioritizes the mother's role, especially when the children are young. The whole package is designed to protect against those unilateral, arbitrary actions, inserting the court process where before there was just unchecked male authority.
So the 1961 ordinance created the structure, but the sources emphasize that this wasn't the end of the story. The courts have continued to expand these protections right into the 21st century.
That's right. The evolution is continuous. The courts are actively interpreting these laws to align them with that original 7th century ethos, that guiding principle. The best of you are those who are best to their women.
That phrase seems to be a real guiding light for modern judges in Pakistan.
It really is. It compels them to interpret the law in a way that favors dignity, fairness, and procedural justice. And the most important area where we see this modern expansion is in khulʿ jurisprudence.
Right, khulʿ being the woman's right to initiate divorce. How have the courts modernized that?
They've recognized that forcing a woman to stay in a loveless or psychologically damaging marriage is itself a violation of her dignity.
So what's the legal standard they use now? How easy is it for a woman to get a khulʿ?
The standard is incredibly progressive. A woman can now be granted a divorce even if she can't prove any specific fault on the husband's part, like cruelty or failure to provide maintenance. The court can grant the khulʿ based simply on her testimony that she cannot live within the limits of Allah.
Within the limits of Allah. What does that mean in legal terms?
It's essentially a legal proxy for irreparable breakdown or irreconcilable differences. It means that if the marriage has deteriorated to a point where the woman feels she can no longer maintain her spiritual or emotional well-being because of the distress of the relationship, the court recognizes her agency to dissolve it.
Wow. So it prioritizes her spiritual and emotional safety over just preserving the contract.
It does, provided that financial adjustment of returning the mar is made. It's profound. It recognizes that emotional and psychological harm is a valid legal reason for her to want out.
And this emphasis on dignity, it extended to other areas as well. The sources point to the period between 2013 and 2017.
Yes, a period of major efforts in rape victim jurisprudence. The courts really focused on modernizing forensic standards, but also, crucially, on protecting the dignity and credibility of victims.
Which sounds like a necessary response to the historical tendency to victim blame or put victims through a second trauma in the legal process.
Precisely. The rulings were aimed at minimizing that re-traumatization during the investigation and trial, making sure the legal system itself upheld a woman's right to dignity and protection. And finally, you see this extend into the professional world with the Workplace Harassment Act of 2010.
Which brings that protection out of the home and into the public sphere.
It recognizes that her right to dignity and safety isn't consigned to the home. It extends to every aspect of her public and professional life.
So if you trace the line from the 7th century Declaration of Property Rights to the 20th century affirmation of bodily autonomy in the U.S. to this modern procedural institutionalization of dignity in Pakistan, we've been tracking the exact same fundamental goal all along, the legal establishment of the woman as an independent agent.
We have, and now we're at the synthesis point. This is where we connect all those dots and really see the universal nature of the rights we've been tracking. We can lay it all out side by side.
Okay, let's do that. Let's map out the comparison, looking at the legal challenge in each era and the specific mechanism the law used to affirm agency. So, starting with Islam in the 7th century, the legal challenge was, you could say, patriarchal tradition and economic dependency.
Absolutely.
The core right they secured was autonomy and agency. And the specific legal tools were judicial annulment for lack of consent, the right to seek khulʿ, and guaranteed inheritance and property ownership.
tools that created immediate economic and personal independence.
Right. Now, jump to the USA in 1973. The primary legal challenge was state coercion and legislative control over personal decisions.
The government telling you what you can and can't do with your own body.
So the core right secured was bodily autonomy, and the mechanism was constitutional interpretation, finding that right to privacy in the 14th Amendment to shield people from the state.
Which established the woman's body and her life decisions as being, in a sense, constitutionally sovereign.
And finally, Pakistan, from 1961 to the present. The challenge was the abuse of custom and unchecked unilateral power within the family.
Right, the gap between what the law said and what happened in practice.
And the goal was securing economic and procedural dignity. The mechanism was modern legislation and judicial innovation regulating polygamy, creating clear divorce procedures, simplifying khulʿ, making those foundational rights actually enforceable.
The comparison is just.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary when you lay it out like that. The 7th century system used religious mandate to create civil rights that were unheard of globally. The U.S. system used constitutional text and judicial reasoning to find implicit rights, and Pakistan used modern legislative procedure to institutionalize and police those rights.
3 totally different toolkits.
Completely different toolkits. But the legal problem they are all trying to solve is identical.
Yeah.
How do you ensure that a woman's decision-making capacity is respected and protected by the highest law of the land?
This shows that the legal language might change, but the goal agency is constant.
It doesn't change.
Yeah. Which brings us to the ultimate question for this deep dive. What is the unifying principle? The ratio decidendi, as the lawyers say. The fundamental reason for the decision that connects all these movements across 13 centuries.
And the source material gives us this synthesized legal conclusion so clearly. And it really is the key takeaway for everyone listening. The overarching judicial principle that validates every single one of these historical movements is this: women are full legal persons with independent dignity, rights, and autonomy. Law must protect their agency, not control it.
Protect their agency, not control it.
That phrase is the ultimate litmus test for the fairness of any legal system. You can see it play out perfectly in each case.
Go on.
In the 7th century, protecting agency meant making sure a woman's consent was legally required for her own marriage, overriding her father's will.
In 20th century America, protecting agency meant recognizing her fundamental right to privacy over her own body, shielding her from the arbitrary will of the state legislature.
And in modern Pakistan, protecting agency means subjecting a husband's traditional powers over divorce and polygamy to rigorous court scrutiny, overriding his arbitrary will.
So the source of that external control changes. It can be the father, the state, or the husband. But the legal mission to dismantle that control and place sovereignty with the woman, that remains the constant universal principle.
That's the golden thread that runs through all of it.
So when we use this lens to measure a society, what's the final conclusion from our deep dive about the relationship between law and female autonomy?
Well, the sources offer a really clear summary. Islam granted women unprecedented economic and personal rights in the 7th century, fundamentally redefining their status. The United States, through its constitutional jurisprudence, recognized a profound sphere of bodily autonomy in the 20th. And Pakistan is in this continuous process of aligning its modern legal framework with both that historic Islamic ethos and contemporary principles to secure dignity in daily life.
So that constant thread is confirmed. It seems the most reliable way to gauge the justice of any legal system isn't just by its written constitution or its religious texts, but by how actively it secures the rights, the dignity, and the agency of its female citizens.
That's it. A just society is measured by the rights it secures for its women.
So as we start to wrap up this really complex, multi-layered deep dive, let's just quickly review the main pieces of knowledge that you, listening, have gained today.
We started by exploring the truly revolutionary nature of 7th century Islamic law. We saw those immediate, judicially enforced rights for property, inheritance, and consent, all anchored by that stunning precedent of Khansa bint Khidam, which established the woman as a full economic and legal person centuries ahead of the global norm.
Then we connected that ancient precedent to the U.S. constitutional doctrine. We detailed how the concept of privacy in Roe v. Wade became this constitutional moment, equating privacy with the capacity for independent decision-making and securing the woman from arbitrary state control over her most personal choices.
And finally, we analyzed that continuous legal evolution in modern Pakistan. We focused on how the Family Laws Ordinance and that progressive khulʿ jurisprudence have institutionalized procedural and economic dignity, making sure that those ancient principles of fairness are actually enforceable and relevant today.
The sheer scope of the comparison, 1,300 years, multiple legal traditions, is just astonishing. But the consistent pursuit of dignity across all of them leaves us with a really potent moral lesson.
It does. And the final moral lesson from the source material is clear, and it really feels like a principle for good governance for any society. It's that when women stand with dignity, society stands with stability. When women are economically and legally empowered, nations rise. The foundational health of any civilization is intrinsically, directly linked to the secured status of its female citizens.
It really makes you pause and reflect on the persistence of the struggle. What stands out to you when you compare systems separated by 13 centuries and completely different legal traditions, religious, constitutional, legislative, and yet they all converge on the absolute necessity of a woman's independent autonomy?
The pursuit of dignity is timeless.
The mechanisms change, the societal pressures shift, but that pursuit, it's timeless. We hope this deep dive has given you a fresh, historically grounded, and legally nuanced perspective on this global and timeless fight for fundamental rights. We'll see you next time.